Welcome to the Owens Recovery Science Podcast, where we dive deep into all things blood flow restriction training. I'm your show host, Johnny Owens, and whether you're a clinician, researcher, or athlete, you've come to the right place. Each episode, we break down the latest research, interview leading experts, and translate complex science into practical applications. We're here to bridge the gap between laboratory findings and real-world implementation.
We have a great guest on today, so we'll just kind of get right into that. Our guest today is Brendan Scott. He is an associate professor at Murdoch University, which is in Australia, down under, where I just learned it's actually winter down there, whereas it's summer in the U.S. And he does a lot of BFR work, has a large number of publications, something like 80 publications. Is that right, Brendan? That's impressive, man. Yeah. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,700 citations I saw. So super cool. And we're excited to talk to him. He works in the MASS lab, which stands for the Murdoch Applied Sports Science Laboratory. Great acronym. Love that. And also as part of the Center for Healthy Aging down there at Murdoch University. And he comes off of the University of Newcastle tree from his education, both undergrad and PhD, right, Brendan?
That's right, yeah.
Outstanding. Well, man, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of, how you got interested in BFR and what you sort of envision as the work y'all are doing there at Murdoch, and we'll kind of get into talking about some of your papers and all that as we go.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. It's exciting to be able to talk about something that I've spent the last decade or so of my life trying to learn about and research. So it's always good to talk to people about this. As you said, I'm currently based in Perth, Western Australia, which is on the west side of Australia. I've been in Perth for about 11 years now, originally from the other side of the country, where I studied at the University of Newcastle. And I suppose I got first interested in BFR during the start of my PhD. So that research was focused on using a systemic hypoxic stimulus, like simulated altitude in resistance exercise, which there was only a handful of papers on at the time. And as I was searching for a PhD topic, that really was of interest to me. I like resistance training. I like getting into the nuance of prescription and how to sort of get the 1%ers to add extra benefit. So that seems kind of interesting to me. And then, of course, I stumbled across this like localized hypoxic stimulus in BFR, which there was more research on at the time. So this would have been around 2012, there or thereabouts, like back end of 2011. And so I got interested in that and started kind of basing my PhD on some of the theory of the physiology that BFR presents the muscles with when you undertake that stimulus. Wrote a few sort of review articles as I was learning about it during my PhD. And then when I started as an academic after finishing my training, I really wanted to get into a bit more experimental work with blood flow restriction. So it's been the majority of my research profile since finishing my PhD. At Murdoch, I teach into our undergrad and master's courses. We've got an undergraduate degree in sports and exercise science and a master in high performance sport, which I'm sort of the course convener of at the moment. That's before this year. I was actually on a 5-year research funded position funded by a grant from the National Health and Medical Research Council, the NHMRC, which is kind of like a funding arm of the Australian government here. So that was a 5-year fellowship position, essentially to do work on blood flow restricted exercise. Specifically walking with BFR for older adults. So my interests are pretty diverse in BFR. Resistance training is probably, if I'm honest, my main interest, just from a personal perspective. I think that's cool. Different modes of exercise, higher intensity modes we've looked at, low intensity walking exercise, different populations from athletes to just general healthy populations, older folks. So I've kind of got diverse interests in it, and that's evolved as I've been working with different research students as well, and trying to incorporate their own individual interests into what we're doing as a group.
Yeah. Outstanding. Was that, as you were starting to get into BFR, was that kind of the introduction of BFR and systemic hypoxia at Newcastle? Were they doing work in that space before, or was that kind of you that got them going there?
Yeah, not really much research on that before. So we were a sort of growing discipline at that point at Newcastle in terms of research productivity. So the way I actually got into it, my PhD supervisor, we were discussing potential topics, and he used to work as a sports physiologist at an institute of sport over here. And he just mentioned, when I was working with one of my athletes one time, I put the hypoxicated device on them when they were doing strength training, and they kind of liked it. Maybe there's something in that. Go see if there's any papers that support it, and we can see if there's anything to that. So Ben had played around with it a little bit as a practitioner, and just kind of anecdotally had reports from the athlete that it looked like they enjoyed the stimulus, or they found it more challenging, and sometimes that's enough for an athlete, even if there's nothing behind it from a physiological perspective. They feel like there's benefit. So yeah, we just started looking at it from that point.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a powerful thing, any way you look at it, really. So we're always having to kind of think about that in the healthcare world, for sure. So, so now I'm kind of curious, because I don't know much about like the systemic hypoxia side of things, because there was a time where people were sort of using those masks and running with them and doing different things. Does it do a similar thing, accelerate fatigue, or I'm unfamiliar, honestly.
Those the altitude training masks that aren't connected to any sort of different air source, all they really do is train the inspiratory muscles of respiration. Like it makes it hard to breathe. Like imagine if you just taped your nose up and stuck a straw in your mouth and tried to exercise. Like it's hard to suck air in. So there was a lot of hype around those during my PhD, actually. So a few people reached out to ask if there was anything to it. But I think there's some research now suggests there's nothing really to it from a true hypoxic training dose. But if you do similar to what we did, breathe an air mixture that has less oxygen in it, you can sort of apply something like nitrogen dilution, where you add nitrogen to the air. So the proportion of the air that is oxygen is reduced. There's less oxygen like there is when you, when you're sort of ascending to terrestrial altitude, although that works on barometric pressure, of course. It's just reducing the amount of oxygen that your body has to work with, essentially, to create a systemic dose.
Got it. Yeah, that would be harder to do than just wrap a cuff around a leg and go for it.
It is. Yeah, it's less practical for sure, far less practical. But the original, some of the data when we were first starting to look into this had used some higher loads, like 70% of 1RM, whereas obviously with BFR, we know that it pretty much has to be low. We actually published a meta-analysis just a month or so ago saying that high load BFR exercise is a dead end. Stop doing it. But at that point, there was some data suggesting that sort of moderate to higher loads with systemic hypoxia could increase muscle size and strength responses. And also being a systemic stimulus, it applies more equally to the muscles of the trunk and the hip. So, obviously there's some of that bench press data demonstrating like the pecs can get some sort of benefit from doing bench press with blood flow restriction, but perhaps not to the same extent as the triceps, which are actually under restriction. But with the systemic hypoxic stimulus, our theory was that we might be able to get a more equal stimulus across all the muscles in the body. And if I fast forward to the conclusions and where that literature sits now, the answer is probably not powerful enough to have a meaningful difference. There's maybe some small differences, but they're not consistently observed. Just because if you compare that to something like BFR, it's a far more aggressive, for lack of a better term, stimulus. It's a more hypoxic, a more demanding physiological stimulus than what you can achieve with systemic hypoxia.
Yeah. I feel like with those systemic things, depending on what topic we're talking about, it always seems like to really see something change, the stimulus has to be sustained for so long that in order to drive the adaptation, like when we start thinking safety and BFR, Claude always kind of comes up, and I always, initially I was like, well, this can make sense because there's a strong contribution of stasis, but it's really more stasis of blood throughout the system for several days, if not longer, so that makes sense. It does kind of make you wonder, like, if you could construct a world where you lived in reduced oxygen levels and then, could use it in that manner somehow, like in incremental exposures. Obviously you wouldn't want to do it for prolonged periods. So
yeah, then there's other challenges that come with prolonged exposure to altitude, in that there's just to appetite regulation. So if you're looking at a muscle mass perspective, you can actually see muscle atrophy when people spend a lot of time at altitude because they eat less. There's changes to appetite regulation.
Less.
Yeah, there's no silver bullets, unfortunately, I don't think, Kyle.
Yeah. We'll keep looking and probably messing people up along the way. Oh goodness. One of the papers we wanted to kind of chat with you about, Brendan, was the that updated panorama that you did. With, I think maybe you spearheaded that, and then Nick Rolnick was on it. I'm trying to remember who else was on it. Dr. Patterson, was Patterson on that with you? I can't.
He wasn't on that one. No, a few other colleagues from Perth were on that one with me as well.
Yeah. You want to tell us a little bit about that paper? That title is an updated panorama for BFR exercise prescription, something like that. I forget the exact title. I'll put it in the show notes.
So the idea for that paper came about because we were seeing in the literature so many different approaches to using blood flow restriction. So, we've already briefly mentioned low load exercise, obviously high load resistance exercise. Mm-hmm. People have used with different modalities of more aerobic or conditioning stimuli, from high through to low intensities, even passive applications with electrical stimulation. So the purpose of that paper was we kind of just wanted it to almost be a signpost, like a place where someone new to the field or a practitioner who doesn't have a lot of coverage of the literature could go and just sort of see what's out there, what's currently being done, with a really rapid summary of where that each little body of literature currently sits. So it was only a brief review. That was the type of paper we published it at. So we couldn't go into depth with lots of the different areas, but we really just wanted that to be a bit of a signpost, like I said.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, the graphic in it is wonderful. I think just the way y'all kind of put it together and used different types of lines and shading to kind of indicate the status of the literature and whatnot. It's almost kind of reminds me of like a clinical practice guideline that we might see in the clinical world, where, you have the evidence is sort of graded to a degree to say, hey, look, this has really a lot of support for it, and this maybe doesn't. I think you guys use the term developing in the paper, or something like that. And really it kind of boiled down to resistance exercise and aerobic exercise of the BFR. Hey, there's some good evidence here, and this definitely does a thing. And then the rest of it was kind of like, yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, exactly. I think BFR is one of those fields, right, where it's still, it's not completely new, but people are hearing about it for the first time still as practitioners. So it's not in some regards. And it seems crazy when you first hear about it. But then when you delve into the literature, it seems super exciting as well. So these incredible responses have been reported, different modes of exercise with different populations. So I think there can be a little bit of hype around particularly some of the newer areas that come up, and there's 2 or 3 papers which in reality have reasonably small samples and they might report a moderate effect, but people get excited. So yeah, I think something as researchers we need to be conscious of, and people who, are talking to practitioners, is it's not always as shiny as it might seem on first glance. We need to be perhaps a little more conservative with having good, robust evidence before we can move forward with being completely confident that particular intervention is going to be consistently effective.
Yeah. Well, and we're certainly starting to see that in a lot of the clinical papers that are starting to come out, where, we're not seeing, as powerful a response as like a lot of people were really kind of hoping to see. Especially I think, the obvious one is ACL, because it's just like the easiest thing to research, even though any clinical study is very difficult, but there's just enough of those that people could study it. But the results have not been amazing in those studies. So definitely rings true. And I think, on our end, when we're trying to relay this information to practitioners, it's like, here's where you know where you're going in terms of adding BFR to resistance exercises. Like we kind of have those parameters figured out, and you don't necessarily have to start right there, but you're working towards that, and you're trying to figure out ways to turn these dials to sort of get you there. Because if you can get there, then now we know we ought to be able to get an increase in muscle size, an increase in muscle strength for you if you can sort of sustain the stimulus long enough.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, you mentioned earlier, you were doing some work in walking, and there was a paper I think you did on older folks walking that I saw recently, and then another area that I kind of wanted to ask you about, because I think you might be the only person that's done this, is actual like upper extremity cycling with BFR.
Yeah.
And those results were kind of not so great. It didn't seem like, but also it's like, hey, nobody's done this. These are sort of early on papers. So could you talk a little bit maybe about your walking stuff, and then, where if you see the upper extremity cycling thing going anywhere, or if it, what your thoughts are there?
Yeah, sure. We'll start with the walking. So, as I mentioned, before the start of this year, for 5 years, I was on a research position focused a lot on BFR walking with older adults. So we've just finished a large RCT where we had older adults walking with BFR versus without BFR to examine some of the responses. And the results look promising in that our comparison group there was actually people who were doing 150 minutes of walking per week, sort of the recommendations for exercise, the sort of low intensity and moderate intensity activity for older adults. But with BFR, they only did 75 minutes of exercise. Our theory was that the BFR makes the exercise more vigorous, quote unquote. So we can do less of it. And the results seem quite similar in a whole bunch of sort of fitness and functional performance outcomes. So that's underway. The study's being finished, but the analysis is underway at the moment. One of my PhD students is leading that. It's kind of the culmination of some of the stuff we've been doing. But we also just recently had accepted a meta-analysis looking at BFR walking modalities with older adults, and looking at the effects that we see across the studies. Because if you just pick one study, it'll say there's no effect of on fitness, or on muscular development. Other studies show that there is an effect. And we saw probably what we expect to see, sort of small effects in most of the measurements you might be interested in, indexes of cardiovascular fitness, indexes of functional performance, via clinical type of tests of functional ability. So there probably is something small to using BFR in a walking modality, but I think it's going to be, if we hone in on it a little more, really dependent on the actual people you're working with. So by that, I mean people who truly need a BFR stimulus because they can't tolerate anything more substantial, or they don't have capacity to do a more vigorous type of exercise. And that means that walking is going to be closer to their ceiling. So it will be a challenging stimulus for them. I think a lot of the literature in BFR is perhaps limited by the fact that in some ways it's applied, it's not really as demanding as what an individual could truly do. And we know that exercise, you have to sometimes fly a little closer to the sun. You need to do something that's a challenge to the body to force it to adapt. So I think we'll probably today talk a little bit later on about refining the exercise stimulus. I think that's something that's going to be crucial if BFR walking is going to be of interest. So yeah, I think that's something we need to do there. Now the arm cycle ergometry stuff, that initially we were looking at a mode to try to investigate some of the neural responses. So I work with a colleague who's an expert in neurophysiology and uses transcranial magnetic stimulation to essentially apply what's called a coil over the motor cortex, delivers a stimulus, and then you can measure the response in the muscle that you're targeting in the motor cortex. And that can give you information about how essentially the brain is connecting to the muscle, and if that's changed in any way in response to a stimulus like exercise with or without BFR or whatever the intervention is where you're using that measurement. So it was far easier to do that in the upper body compared to the lower body, which was the first reason why we used the arm cycle ergometry, because that was our primary outcome and we wanted to be able to measure it well. But if we think about different modes of aerobic exercise, it doesn't make sense there'd be a difference between, cycling with the lower body versus cycling with the upper body and the stimulus being applied, as in BFR being the stimulus. So I suppose it's a little surprising perhaps that we didn't see big changes in some of the physiological responses. Again, though, it might be because we didn't prescribe the exercise in the way that it would need to be. I don't know if there's very many studies that have used upper body arm cycle ergometry with BFR. Certain population.
I think you're it.
It might be. Yeah. And we didn't see much, so maybe no one else wants to pursue it. But it's certainly a mode of exercise that people in clinical worlds would engage with. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, but more work to be done, I suppose.
Absolutely. And you guys I think you used a higher pressure there, like a 70% pressure, if I'm right, in that study, which was kind of unique too. Was there a reason you chose that higher pressure? I don't recall from reading the methods.
Yeah, I actually can't remember. This study's going back some years ago now.
Sorry, we had, I didn't mean to do that to you, man.
we had a graduate student from the US actually travel over on sort of like an internship position, and she ran that study and did a bit of pilot work. So while I can't remember the specifics of why we landed on the pressure in that study, generally my approach in research is if we're changing the exercise stimulus, the pressure kind of in the cuff needs to change along with that as well. So we always tend to do a lot of pilot testing to find the most appropriate pressure that people can complete, but is still challenging. So another example where we've done that is using BFR with repeated sprint exercise on a bike for T-sport athletes. And we actually had to apply 45% of AOP with that because any heavier pressure and participants just couldn't get through the repeated sprint activities. So we were kind of limited we could see there. So I reckon there's this kind of like sliding scale of the interaction between pressure and the demand of exercise.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like there enough studies have kind of indicated that there's something there, without us having really just robust data to tell us exactly when to use this pressure or this load or this intensity. But it certainly seems that there's some kind of a signal there kind of telling us, hey, that higher pressures, maybe that helps you kind of augment the load. I have a buddy that, when I first met him and we were just kind of getting to know one another, we were talking, he's a really sharp guy. And he goes, when people have told me about BFR, it really just kind of sounds like the pressure is just another way of prescribing load. And I went, yeah, that's kind of a pretty genius way to think about it in some respects. So, if you can't add too much weight, then let's just add more pressure, and we can kind of turn those dials and figure out what works for each individual ultimately, because that's what we got to do. And I think sometimes we forget, we get a little bit caught up in, like trying to figure out like what is the exact right thing. But in the real world, the person comes back and you adjust a little bit, and then they come back again and you adjust a little bit. And the reality is, like within 3 or 4 visits, you ought to be able to kind of dial everything in to where it's really set for that person. And now it's like come in and get your grind on, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the practical take that we've been talking a lot about that lately. Some of the research we want to do is refining some of those prescription parameters. But then what we often come back to is in the real world, this happens over 3, 4, 5 visits, as you're suggesting, based on perception, based on just the view of the person doing the exercise and the practitioner, your expertise, like, oh, it looks like you could do heaps more reps there. So we either need to make the weight heavier, or we need to add more pressure or decrease the rest, or there's, as you mentioned, so many different levers you can pull. And that's probably what makes BFR hard to prescribe, right? Because it's just another factor that you're adding in with the cuff pressure. But also, is it continuous or intermittent pressure being applied? The width of the cuff, there's so many extra kind of acute exercise variables that are being introduced in BFR that, there's like this balancing act between all these different things. It's some go up, some go down. You're trying as a clinician and practitioner to balance that all out to land on a stimulus, essentially, that just provides some sort of overload from a physiological perspective to the muscle. That's really what we're trying to achieve, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and it's funny I've been in the physical therapy world for over 20 years now, and just seeing what we get taught kind of evolve. I mean, you just had the ACSM guidelines change to where they said, look, here's really what you need, these 10 to 12 sets per week of exercise volume at, pretty high effort levels. And I'm like, finally, I feel like we're getting in the ballpark, and getting away from these, this idea of so many reps and so many sets is sort of what you have to hit. And it's more kind of based on how you're able to perform these things. So, that segues pretty good into really, the main paper we wanted to talk about, Brendan, was this paper on reps in reserve you guys have in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning. So the title of it is explaining the variance in repetitions in reserve after low load blood flow restricted exercise. So you want to maybe tell us a little bit about sort of maybe the idea that sort of got that going, and then we'll kind of get into the weeds on exactly what all you did and showed and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure. So it comes off the back of what we were just discussing, the prescription and trying to refine the prescription for BFR exercise, because we've noted, as I'm sure you guys have as well, that there just seems to be a lot of variability in how people perform BFR exercise. And in this context, when I say perform, I mean how many reps they can do. And there's that standard 75 rep scheme, 30 reps in the first set with 3 sets of 15 following after that. Just seeing some people do that, it seemed like a real battle to get that last rep in the 4th set for some, and others found it a breeze. So we were kind of interested in trying to refine that a little bit. And so this was with a master's student. We recruited people who had some resistance training experience initially, and they did 4 different sessions. So this was at 30% of 1 rep max with 60% of arterial occlusion pressure. And the reason we chose those numbers was just to split the difference, just to go in the middle for some of our primary analysis. But we also expanded on that with different load ranges as well. So we did some sessions at 20% and 40% to get that whole spectrum. And what we were interested in initially was seeing if we could try to equalize the effort between participants by using repetitions in reserve. So if people aren't familiar with what reps in reserve means, it's essentially in lots of contexts, just a perceptual rating of how many more repetitions you could do before you fail. And a lot of research in high load resistance exercise has shown that it's a pretty good estimate or approximation of failure when you're making those estimates close to failure. So if you are lifting 85% of your 1RM and you say, okay, I think now I've got 2 reps in reserve, most people are pretty accurate with that. But we thought with BFR and the variability in performance that I just talked about before, if people are making those estimates after 15 reps, when they might have many more in the tank, that the estimations could be some way off. And that's really what we found. We found that there's a substantial error in the reps in reserve estimate. And it was almost perfectly explained by how many reps you could do. So what that means is that the people who had the largest error also did the most reps. So when they were making that estimate after 15 reps in the last set, they might have had, there was actually one participant who did 272 reps, I think, in the final set.
Good Lord.
I know, that's like an aerobic workout from
what
my
in
perspective.
the world?
That was at 20% of 1RM, so the lowest load. But of course, after 15 reps, she was a mile away from fatigue. So she was trying to make this estimate. I don't know, maybe 50, maybe 200, somewhere in that ballpark. I'm unsure. So our overall view on that was, if we're using reps in reserve in that way, it's probably not a fantastic approach, just because with the low loads, we're so far from failure when we're trying to make that. We also repeated the session at 30% 1RM because we wanted to look at the reliability of the repetitions in reserve in terms of the actual reps that people could do and their estimate, and found that it was reasonably reliable, but there was a bit of variation. So sort of plus or minus 7 reps if you look at the limits of agreement, Land-Ortman analysis in the paper. So there's still some variability within an individual. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that when we prescribe BFR exercise in studies like this, right, we measure 1RM. So the maximum strength an individual can produce, the heaviest load they can lift for a single rep. And then we ask them to lift 30%, 20% of that for 75 reps. And if you use an endurance training type of analogy, it's like asking someone to do a 20, 30 meter sprint, 40-yard sprint, and measure their speed across that, and then prescribe marathon running pace. Like they're so divorced from each other, the test and the prescription or the performance.
Right.
Of course there will be error. And so that's what got us thinking a little bit about, like, why are we doing it that way? Why are we using strength as our primary assessment of what someone should be able to do in blood flow restricted exercise? We've actually got another study that the same students continue on to a PhD just presented some of the data to us earlier this week, where we're trying to actually tease out what contributes to changes in performance. And muscular endurance seems to be the main thing that can explains the variance in performance. So explaining about 46% or so of the variance in how many reps people can do with a muscular endurance assessment. So I don't know how we're going to progress that as a field to getting better estimates of muscular endurance and building that into the prescription parameters. Maybe there's good ways to do that, but we're kind of at the early stages, I think, of trying to understand.
Yeah. Well, and you're taking, NIRS measurements and trying to think if there are other measurements you're taking that at least are kind of in the, maybe giving you some information on why an individual might have varied degrees of performance on that.
Yeah, if I pause because I think there's so much involved, right?
Yeah.
There's so many factors that contribute to endurance performance. There's, like, if we think about just capillarization, some people will have a greater capacity to continually deliver blood and remove metabolites from that local area that can inhibit performance. So that will be a benefit to some people compared to others. There might be motivational factors at play. Some people are just happy to keep grinding. Some people get to a point in a set where it just feels hard and they stop lifting the weight. I think there's so many things contributing.
Yeah.
So measurement with NIRS, for example, you can get indexes of changes in blood flow characteristics and oxygenation profiles at the local level. But yeah, it's one of a bunch of variables think that are at play influence BFR performance.
Yeah. And we had Dominic Pesta on a couple episodes ago. He's from Denmark, I believe. And they just published a paper in Diabetes showing changes in insulin sensitivity and mitochondria and capillarization and all those things. And I was kind of asking him what he thought of this idea that, because I remember a while back talking to Chris Fry, and he had done some work where they had shown whether or not you had good blood flow to skeletal muscle really seemed to be in many ways a determining factor as to whether or not your muscle would adapt to resistance exercise, in particular in older individuals. And so, and we certainly see at different stages clinically people's muscle seems to maybe not respond to our stimuli that we're giving it. And so it just got me wondering, if there's some point in time where we figure out what all these measurements mean, and we're able to kind of build a profile, if you will, that tells us, hey, this person at this stage, given this level of capillarization, whatever, they're going to respond best to this type of an exercise intervention. This is what they really need to kind of help normalize the system and get it back to a place where it's more adaptable, if you will. And I think we see that happening on the protein synthesis side of things too, right? When we start talking about anabolic resistance and things of that nature, it's like the human body, skeletal muscle, all of it changes based on what we do. And I think we're just now figuring out, man, there's a whole lot we still just don't know in terms of like, how do we figure out when to give the best intervention, if you will, or what it looks like, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes these things go full circle as well. And we start out not knowing anything as a field, and then we do a bunch of studies and we think we know more, and we think that there's important nuance that we have to explain. And then at the back end of that, like we just talked about with prescription parameters for general resistance exercise, it comes back to just lift some heavy stuff until it's hard. You'll get benefits. And it re-simplifies itself. But in that process, we know a lot more about why that's an appropriate approach.
Right.
At the start, when it's like, oh, we don't know what causes these changes. We don't know what's important from a prescription perspective. So I think you have to do that work to get an understanding of why simple works. But maybe even from a practitioner's perspective, simple working is probably the best outcome, right? And it keeps scientists like me in a job, because we get to do some academic work around the complex for a period of time before we can tell people to do what you were doing before. But now we understand.
Now we can just be confident that we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I tell you, when I speak to clinicians all the time in our classes that we teach, and I'm like, our jobs are freaking hard, because there's so much we don't really know, what's the best way of doing this. And I look at exercise as something where we have a pretty good idea of what needs to be done, but then really when you kind of get into it, there's still so much we really don't know. And I think your point is very well made, that a lot of times it does come full circle, and in the end it's just like, just work freaking hard and figure out a way to do that. And that's probably your best bet. I like it. So going back to your reps and reserve paper, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was just the difference in how many repetitions somebody can do at like a given percentage of their one repetition maximum. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, and maybe how y'all were kind of considering that as well, because you had some references in there to papers that have shown this, like even depending on the task, you get some variability. And it was wild to me to see. So
yeah, I think when we're all doing an undergrad degree or a course in gym instructing or whatever it might be, you see these really pretty tables that says 75% of 1RM, everyone can do 10 repetitions. And that's the standard for all exercises and all people in the world. And it seems neat and makes prescription easy. But when you start experiencing prescribing exercise for people, you realize that it doesn't always hold true. There's some data suggesting that females, for example, can do slightly more repetitions than their male counterparts, greater fatigue resistance, and other things like endurance, I think, can play a role as the load gets lighter and the reps become long, or the number of reps becomes increased. So yeah, I think it's something that's always been there, but we've maybe tried to simplify that too early. If we come back to that previous discussion point. And I think why it really becomes important for BFR is coming back to my point of the test is so different to the training. So if you're prescribing for an Olympic weightlifter or a powerlifter, and they're never going to do more than 4 reps in a set, and you're basing your prescription on a single rep attempt, well, you're going to be within the ballpark. You're going to be pretty solid there. But if you're trying to prescribe the weight that someone should lift 75, 80 times, it's from a single rep, it becomes a bit more divorced from the actual testing stimulus. So yeah, I think it's certainly something we need to try to refine. As I mentioned before, I reckon there's just too many new things at play, and probably in terms of what's influencing those increases in variability as the number of reps increases. I think we just need better tests that are more specific to the training. So, like what's something we're doing at the moment, a muscular endurance test. It's 30% of 1 RM with that so that's been predefined with blood flow restriction. Do as many reps as you can. So it's really similar to the blood flow restriction training stimulus, and that's where we've seen a pretty close association between how many reps someone can perform in that muscular endurance test. So. Yeah, it's a hard one to nail down. I don't think we have a good way to explain all of that variance just yet. But as practitioners and researchers, we need to know it exists. Because if we try to ring fence everyone into the same prescription parameters, of course, there's going to be some people that fall outside the bounds on either side. And that, again, coming back to the simple approach, is probably just where over a few sessions in a real world example, you just build on it. That was too hard, let's regress. That was too easy, let's increase the demand.
Right. So I'm kind of curious then, when you go to, this isn't necessarily your world anymore, but if you were building out a program for someone, do you start with, and you're going to incorporate BFR, do you yourself kind of start with percentages of 1 rep max, or have you started to kind of use different ways of determining what does this exercise intensity look like in terms of the load that's being lifted? And then, are you using any other information to help you determine pressure to use?
Yeah. My short answer is yes. I still use the percentage of 1 RM because it's probably at the moment the approach that has the most evidence to support it. We know that we still get benefits from doing that, right? So that the recommended ranges of the cuff pressure, the recommended ranges of the load you should lift, they're recommended because they've consistently demonstrated benefit in, if we're focused on resistance exercise, muscle size and strength improvements. So I still use that, but then I think pretty quickly, if you have the ability to, it's in a research environment, often you don't have the ability to individualize the stimulus for each participant, then you just get muddy data. But if you can, working with a real world person, I would just use my own judgment and conversation with the person I'm working with to change the stimulus as we go through. So you've kind of got a starting point, and then you have to change the stimulus pretty quickly soon after. Now, I suppose I'm hopeful that we can try to just get our starting point to be a little bit more reflective of each individual. That's maybe where I see the research going, if we can define better ways to incorporate some sort of endurance task. But I think there's always going to be a little bit of nuance in adjusting the program as you go through it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I think in the physical therapy world, we just kind of slowly sort of get there, because really ultimately what we're doing is kind of like a graded exposure kind of thing, until ultimately we're able to actually push exercise hard, but being able to dial it in and quickly in the sports performance world and those arenas becomes a bit more important, certainly.
But
we can kind of gradually get there.
Too, right? Is gradually building the stimulus for someone who's not familiar with it. So even though it might not start within the recommended, ranges of load and pressure and exercise prescription, if you do start with that in someone who's untrained, a rehab patient, for example, they're going to get really sore from this. I know a lot of the early data in BFR suggested that there was very minimal muscle damage and perceptions of soreness in response to this training, because the load was light, was the theory. But anyone who's done BFR knows that that's probably not the case in most scenarios. When you start something that's pretty demanding, it makes you sore. We published with Johnny actually a few years ago a survey where we surveyed allied health practitioners around the world. Most of them came from North America, actually. We had, what was it, over 300 participants in the end did this survey who used BFR in clinical environments, working with diseased populations, rehab environments. And there was over 60% of these clinicians reported that their patients experienced DOMS in response to BFR exercise. And that 62%, that's far greater than what had previously been reported in similar studies. So I think Stephen Patterson ran a similar survey a few years before with Chris Brandner, and they saw something like 40 or 45% from memory of the practitioners reporting DOMS in their patients. So I think maybe what we saw with that was a combination of the people that we were recruiting in that specifically work with untrained and unfamiliar to exercise populations. But also if people are going, that there was an improvement in how these practitioners were following the guidelines, right? By and large, they were following the 2019 paper that Stephen led in the exercise prescription, which is quite demanding. And if people are going straight to that, then it's of course going to be a pretty demanding stimulus that maybe causes some muscle soreness and side effects in the first few sessions. So as you suggested, building up slowly from a safety perspective, a participant comfort and tolerability perspective is going to be a good way to go at it. And that also gives you wiggle room to refine the stimulus as you're moving forwards too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I always kind of think about the rep max testing and the reps in reserve and RPE scales. And, one of the things I feel like you always hear is, well, yeah, these are great, but, they really only work well in trained individuals kind of thing. And, I know that's accurate, but at the same time, I always kind of go, well, I'm also training the person that I'm working with. I'm turning them into a trained individual so that their feedback can get more refined over time with me as well. So there's, it's not as though people's perception of what they're doing doesn't change, matter of fact, I kind of wondered, in reading y'all's paper, I was like, gosh, I'd be so curious to see if they just kind of repeated what they did here, after 3 exposures of this, would how much would those reps in reserve estimates change? Would they get better? Would they get worse? Would they not change at all? So I don't know. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So that's part of why we tested the 30% condition twice, because we wanted to look at the reliability of that. And we didn't see any sort of a systematic improvement in the assessment, the perceptual assessments of reps in reserve from session 1 to session 2. So not to suggest that there wouldn't be if they did it 5 or 6 times, that the first few might have been a shock. But we didn't see any differences, large differences there in a systematic direction, everyone getting better at it. But I do take your point that there's a bit of familiarity with what failure feels like. And if people aren't familiar to going to actual failure with particularly low load resistance exercise, we asked participants in that study to go, it was bench press, so go until you couldn't lift the bar off your chest. And the researcher could then, easily spot the bar up. But we wanted them to genuinely fail a rep and not be able to complete it. And taking yourself to that place is, after 272 reps for that one participant, that's a dark place to be.
It's incredible.
So
I can't imagine 272 of anything.
That's one monthly training volume in one set. But it's being able to get to that position of being at failure to anchor what failure is. So then you can work back and say, I'm, 10 reps from that or 5 reps from that is the challenge. There's some evidence for the higher load applications of reps in reserve, that people who are more trained are better at making those estimates, probably because they're more familiar with what the target of their estimate is. But as you suggested, you're also training people that you're working with, that people engage in exercise don't remain untrained for very long. Once they start training, they quickly begin to adapt, and then they become more comfortable with making these perceptual estimates. Their adaptations will start to slow down as they reach that that kind of point of diminishing returns when they've been in a training program for some time. So it's not a static thing where someone can't estimate their reps in reserve or respond in a certain way to exercise.
Yeah. And there was another kind of individual contributor to how well people tolerated the exercise, and that was the conditioned pain response y'all measured. If I remember correctly, it was their endurance and then just how tolerant they were of pain were kind of the two pieces that seem to explain the most variability, if you will. And
yeah. And that's some work we're continuing on at the moment, looking at conditioned pain modulation, pain threshold, pain tolerance, so threshold being the point at which someone perceives a stimulus as painful, and tolerance being how long, once it is painful, they can sustain that for, with our thought being that BFR can feel painful. So if people are able to better tolerate that or not feel pain for until later in the set, then that's potentially beneficial. Coming back to the endurance assessment that I was talking about before, I reckon that's probably all bundled up into that endurance assessment as well. Like if we measure lots of different physiological outcomes, then that might explain different parts of it. But if you do an endurance test, you go until you fail a rep. It's similar to what we're talking about with the BFR protocol. You're doing an endurance test. Well, that pain is kind of probably going to be bundled into that, as is motivation, as is capillarization, mitochondrial density. All of those things are perhaps bundled into that single performance metric. It's a bit more accessible and easier to implement. So maybe that's a way to consider that too.
Yeah, I like that thought. That makes a ton of sense to me, actually. So that's a good deal. Well, Brendan, what other stuff do y'all got on the docket? At your lab, what do you? Is there something you're just really jazzed about right now that you're looking at, or just kind of grinding away, or what's the scoop?
The refining the exercise stimulus thing we've been talking a lot about today is something I'm pretty excited about. So I've got the PhD student who was a master's student when he published that paper, the Reps in Reserve paper. And he's trying to refine that at the moment and see if we can actually use an endurance test to develop basically a regression equation that better predicts the load required for someone to fail at 75 reps. And then we can we're going to try to validate that equation. He's just developing it at the moment. We're going to externally validate it to see if it holds in other populations and across different exercises too, because that's something we haven't touched on. But what's to say that it can be extended beyond the bench press or the leg extension or does it apply equally? I
was going to say, I thought all you had to study was longer knee extension and bicep curl and you're good, right?
That was the initial BFR research, right? It was the only equipment anyone had in their lab was a knee extension and some dumbbells to do bicep kibbles.
Right.
But I think, and especially once you start going from single joint to multi-joint exercise with BFR, I think that's where things get really messy, because you've got that sort of disjointed response in the muscles that are under the restrictive stimulus and those that aren't under the restrictive stimulus. So as the exercise goes on, that stimulus will probably be a little bit separated between those restricted versus non-restricted muscles. So I think need to untangle there. That's pretty exciting for me. I've got another PhD student who's continuing on some of the work I touched on briefly before, and we're using TMS to try to examine some of the neuroplasticity or neurophysiological response. So that student's going to be looking at resistance exercise this time and trying to untangle if there is some neural adaptations, because there's pretty limited research in that space at the moment and no real compelling findings that BFR results in potent neural adaptations like we know high load strength training does. And that's proposed as one of the reasons why BFR can increase similarly muscle hypertrophy to high load training, but the strength improvements are typically larger when you lift heavy weights because of those neural adaptations being a little bit more potent with that stimulus. So we're trying to uncover that a little bit. That's very early days. That student's just starting their research at the moment. There are a few studies that I'm pretty interested in, but I have other interests outside of BFR as well. Other students who are doing different kinds of So, yeah, it's kind of a broad spectrum of things.
It sounds like
on.
a lot to keep up with, honestly.
It can be hard. Yeah.
Just thinking about it, I'm like, man, all we really do is talk BFR. You gotta.
Yeah, there's a bit to be across. That's why it's good when you have good students who, they come to a meeting with you and give you a little refresher of what they've been working on. Oh, that's right. I've forgotten about that aspect of the particular study, because there might be 7 or 8 on the go at once across the group.
Yeah, for sure. Well, man, we appreciate you coming on. Is there a way people can find your work, get in touch with you if they want to, what have you? Are you on the social medias? Are you?
On social media, less and less.
I understand that.
Only Twitter is probably the best approach. I can flick you through my handle and can add to the show notes here for that.
Yep.
That's probably the easiest way. But yeah, and then ResearchGate and things like that for publications.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate having you on. I'm sure we'll want to have you on again to talk more as y'all continue the good work down there. And
no, it's fun.
We'll sign off.
Good. It's been really fun chat.
Right on, Brendan. Thanks so much, man.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks for tuning in to the Owens Recovery Science Podcast. Before we go, a quick reminder that the information discussed on this show is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your treatment or training regimen. For show notes and additional resources, be sure to check out owensrecoveryscience.com. And don't forget to like the show and subscribe for more evidence-based insights. Until next time, earn your deflate.